So welcome to today's UCL lunchtime lecture, only the second in this new season. I'm Professor Paul McMillan. I'm a member of the Lunchtime Lecture Committee, and I've got the pleasure of being your host and chair for today. Before we begin, can I make sure that mobile telephones are off, or at least on flight mode? And, so our lecture today is by Professor Meg Russell from our Department of Political Science. And as you can see, she has a very topical title. She's pointed out that if the audience is not quite as full as it might be, we're apparently in competition with the UCU pensions event. But I think that this will be an excellent place to be. Meg just informed me also that in fact she's only been a professor since last Wednesday. Thank you. So with no further ado, we give you Professor Meg Russell.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now I hope I get the sound levels right. So my question today is, does Parliament matter? This is a deliberately provocative question, and one to which I hope to give a slightly counterintuitive answer, at least going by much contemporary political and journalistic rhetoric. In doing so, I'll draw on some of my own research at UCL's Constitution Unit. So to start with the rhetoric, it certainly seems fashionable nowadays to suggest that Parliament doesn't matter, that it's somehow a toothless and relatively peripheral institution. Here's William Hague, currently leader of the House of Commons, but speaking here in 2000 when he was Conservative Party leader. Parliament's power to hold the executive to account has been declining for over a century, but the present government have done more than any other in living memory to create a parliament that bows and scrapes to ministers. Clearly he was speaking about Tony Blair's government. A few years later, here's Chris Huhne, at that time Liberal Democrat Shadow Home Secretary. And he describes the House of Commons as a rubber stamp, a legislature on its knees, meeting to elect a government once every 4 or 5 years and put on a pantomime at Prime Minister's questions. And just to complete the political set, this is Angela Eagle, who's currently Labour's shadow leader of the House of Commons, speaking earlier this year. The House of Commons, our only elected house, should be the beating heart of our democracy. But during my 22 years in Parliament, I've watched as its power and effectiveness in scrutinising the executive has deteriorated. These are views which chime with much of what we read in our newspapers. For example, here's Simon Jenkins in The Guardian in 2006, describing the House of Commons as God's gift to dictatorship. And these kinds of claims are nothing new. These are also the words of a journalist, echoing those of Jenkins, suggesting that the House of Commons no longer controls the executive. On the contrary, the executive controls the House of Commons. So far, so unsurprising, but these words were written in 1904. Likewise, we can find academic views which chime with these. Here's a former UCL law professor largely agreeing, suggesting that Great Britain today is a country in which an all-powerful executive, acting through a subservient parliamentary majority, exercises despotic power. He published those thoughts in a volume entitled The Passing of Parliament in 1952. It was just one of a number of books with similarly gloomy titles coming out around that time. Academic gloom, at least among some, was still present decades later. For example, Richardson and Jordan famously referred to Britain in 1979 as a post-parliamentary democracy. It's also worth saying that these kind of claims are not uniquely made about our legislative institutions here in Britain. Similar comments are often made in other parliamentary democracies around the world. My response is primarily limited to Britain today because that's where I've conducted my research. But the kind of dynamics that I describe apply to a greater or lesser extent to parliamentary institutions much more broadly. As should now be clear, my question about whether Parliament matters isn't a new one. In fact, I should acknowledge that it's been asked in exactly these terms before. I borrow my title from a book written by Philip Norton, one of the best-known scholars of the British Parliament, who tried to counter some of the academic cynicism I've just cited. His book was published in 1993. His answer, particularly for a defender of Parliament, could be seen as decidedly mixed. In his own words, the correct response to the question, does Parliament matter, is yes, certainly, but. Yes, certainly, inasmuch as Parliament has many functions, some of which are absolutely fundamental. The makeup of the House of Commons decides who can form the government. In extremis, the Commons can remove that government from office by a confidence vote. For so long as the government remains in office, it has to answer publicly to Parliament for its actions. MPs have a representative role, which links government to citizens and citizens' concerns. Parliament also acts as a forum for public debate. It thus crucially legitimates what governments do. But when it came to policy, Norton was much more cautious, suggesting that Parliament is not a significant initiator of public policy and is an infrequent influencer of the content of public policy. But Norton's book is now more than 20 years old, and in that period, a lot has changed, including in Parliament itself. There's been a gradual decline in party cohesion in the House of Commons. That is a reduction in MPs' willingness to simply blindly follow the party line. Gradual decline under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown has been followed by a more precipitous decline under the 2010 coalition. There's been significant growth in the importance of select committees in the House of Commons. These committees, one of which shadows each government department, were established broadly in their current form in 1979. Since then, they've gradually gained resources, developed an increasing media profile, and in 2010, their membership was reformed to enhance their independence. There have also been particularly important changes in the House of Lords. In 1999, the first Blair government removed the great majority of hereditary peers, which ended a conservative dominance of that chamber that had lasted 200 years. Initially perhaps looking advantageous to a Labour government, this change to a more party-balanced chamber made members of the Lords feel suddenly more legitimate, giving them more confidence to challenge government policy. Both these changes have affected the legislative process, as we'll see. Although perhaps less important, there have also been other reforms to that process as well, such as Commons Bill committees starting to take evidence in public from outside groups and experts. There have also been various other changes, such as a reform in 2010 giving backbench MPs more control over the Commons agenda, allowing debates on uncomfortable subjects for government and opposition party leaders to reach the floor. Other changes could be mentioned as well. The issue of party cohesion, the first one, has been extensively researched by others, including Philip Norton and more recently Philip Cowley at the University of Nottingham. The last change is too recent yet to be reliably assessed. But we've done research in the other three areas, and I'd like to give you a glimpse of what we found. This would be a good moment to pause quickly and acknowledge the contribution of many others, aside from myself, to this research. First, crucially, those who funded it, noted on the slide, the Nuffield Foundation and the ESRC. Second, the various research staff and research interns at the Constitution Unit who've contributed to data collection and analysis. And last, the numerous people in the political world who've cooperated with the research. I want to draw briefly from three projects that we've conducted. All three explore the area identified by Norton as a shortcoming in the early 1990s, that is, Parliament's impact on policy. The first is an analysis of select committees conducted jointly with the House of Commons Committee Office. This was the biggest study of these committees since their establishment. It traced the work of 7 committees over 13 years, including the over 700 reports that they produced and over 13,000 conclusions and recommendations in those reports. Over 1,000 recommendations to central government were traced to see whether they'd been implemented. Second, research on the House of Lords since its reform in 1999. This included an analysis of every vote in the chamber, and particularly tracking the effect of every government defeat, plus postal questionnaire surveys of members. Third, the biggest study of the legislative process at Westminster since the mid-1970s. This traced the passage of 12 bills through both chambers of Parliament, including looking at every amendment proposed, over 4,000 in total. All three projects, as well as gathering data from documentary sources, included a large number of in-depth interviews with people involved, 250 to 300 interviews altogether. These included members of the Commons and the Lords, parliamentary staff, ministers, civil servants, and outside groups. So what did we find? In each case, results can be readily broken down into the quantifiable, based largely on documentary evidence, and the less quantifiable, mostly drawn from interviews. Starting with select committees, it's important to emphasize that while these committees have grown increasingly visible and widely respected, they've got very little formal power to make government do anything at all. They spend most of their time conducting investigations into implementation of past government policy and future policy options. They take evidence in public from government ministers and officials and outside groups. They publish reports presenting this evidence and making recommendations, mostly targeted at government. Ministers are expected to publish a written response, but are otherwise under no obligation to act, and committees have no formal means to make them do so. So in theory, ministers could simply brush aside what committees say. Indeed, parliamentary cynics might expect that to be the case, and some people had suggested that was so. But our research strongly demonstrated otherwise. Just under half the select committee recommendations that we traced had clearly been implemented by government. Given that we looked at only 7 committees out of a total 20, we estimated that there were probably about 450 select committee recommendations being implemented by government every year. That's hardly peripheral. The select committees in particular have no formal role in the legislative process. Legislation, the committee stage of legislation in the Commons is taken in a separate set of non-specialist committees. Yet our separate study of the legislative process found over 1,700 mentions of select committees during debate on the 12 bills. That's almost 150 mentions on average per bill. Notably, many of the amendments made to the bills in Parliament were clearly traceable to ideas proposed by select committees. This already suggests that select committees are important to the policy process, and they may have been a key addition at Westminster, helping rebalance between Parliament and the executive. But our interviews indicated how a focus purely on measurable impact would be too simplistic. Repeatedly, interviewees emphasized that the implementation of committee recommendations was only the tip of the iceberg in terms of their policy influence. Committees, despite their lack of formal power, exert various other subtle forms of influence. For example, holding an inquiry focuses media and government attention on a policy issue, forcing ministers and civil servants to think it through. Committees gather together a body of evidence, which is published and informs wider debates. Crucially, they also have a power of exposure. Because their evidence sessions are held in public, ministers, civil servants, and others are publicly held to account. They have not only to think through their positions, but justify them publicly, potentially in the glare of the media. Notably, this power isn't only exerted over central government. It also applies to other public bodies, and increasingly to the private sector as well. In recent years, Commons Select Committees have held high-profile evidence sessions with various private sector groups. For example, bankers have been held to account by the Treasury Committee. Starbucks, Amazon, and Google had to explain their tax affairs to the Public Accounts Committee. And Rupert Murdoch and his News International colleagues answered to the Culture, Media and Sport Committee over phone hacking. If select committees hadn't existed, these key figures would not have been held to account in any public forum at all. This power of exposure was considered very important by our interviewees. As one civil servant put it, committees' biggest influence, particularly in Whitehall, is the fear of having to appear in front of them. Likewise, a former senior minister who'd held various cabinet posts said that when thinking through the merits of different policy options, he'd often ask himself, how would this look if there was a committee inquiry into it? This tells us something important about the nature of parliamentary power, which I'll return to. The story with respect to the House of Lords is similar. During the first 13 years after the Lords was reformed, from 1999 to 2012, the government was defeated in the House of Commons just 8 times. This is unsurprising in one respect, though I'll also return to this, because government, of course, has a majority in the Commons. In the same period in the Lords, where it has no majority, it was defeated over 500 times. The way that defeats went up in the Lords post-1999 was widely noted. In particular, in the 2002-03 session alone, the Blair government was defeated 88 times. But like Select Committee reports, these defeats might be dismissed on the basis that the Lords can't enforce them. In practice, on most bills, the Commons, as the elected chamber, can overrule the Lords. Without further investigation, it therefore might be assumed, and some did think this, that Lords' defeats were relatively unimportant. But again, our research demonstrated otherwise. Of the 506 government defeats in this period, again, just under half were largely or wholly accepted by government and the House of Commons. That is 180 defeats over 13 years. Some of these were on relatively small matters, but most weren't, because trivial disputes are usually resolved without even coming to a vote. Some were on very major matters. For example, the Blair government was repeatedly defeated over its attempt to restrict access to trial by jury. In the end, it largely gave up. Blair was also defeated on his plans to introduce identity cards. In the end, the Lords compromised on delaying introduction of the cards until after the 2010 election, when it was likely there would be a new government. Of course, there was a new government, and it almost immediately scrapped the whole scheme. Gordon Brown was defeated over his attempt to extend detention without trial of terrorist suspects from 28 to 42 days. Notably, 2 of Blair's defeats in the Commons had been over attempting to increase it to 90 days. The coalition government has suffered relatively fewer defeats, as it's stronger numerically in the Lords than Labour was. But for example, coalition plans to abolish various public bodies were also blocked by the Lords. These are all very visible changes. But again, other evidence suggests this is just the tip of the iceberg. Asked in a questionnaire to comment on which were the Lords' most important means of influence, 85% of its members agreed that the Chamber's real influence is exerted as much through persuasion as through defeats. When asked in another survey what mattered to the Chamber's influence on the policy process, just 1/3 agreed that defeats were very important, and more than half said the same about government bringing forward its own amendments under pressure from peers. Because government has no partisan majority in the Lords, it's a place where a good deal of negotiation goes on all the time across party lines. As one peer put it, on the whole, government ministers will bend over backwards to help you because the last thing they want is a vote. Of course, a vote could mean a defeat. Since the late 1990s, an increasingly elaborate and formalized system of parliamentary so-called handling strategies has been established to second-guess the concerns of parliamentarians before bills are introduced. Here it's worth making an important point, as illustrated by the fact that these handling strategies apply not just to the Lords, but also to the Commons. Peers can't get anything agreed on their own. All bills need the assent of MPs. So a Lord's defeat is simply a way of throwing a policy question back to the House of Commons and asking, are you really sure? The ultimate pivotal voters at Westminster continue to be, as they've always been, government backbench MPs. If government backbench opinion in the Commons is solid, the government will generally be able to win against the Lords. But if backbenchers aren't fully behind the government, and in an environment where they're increasingly willing to defy their whips, ministers will often give in to Lords' opposition. That means a more assertive Lords doesn't weaken the Commons, but strengthens it. Our wider work on the legislative process backs all this up. Looking at the 4,361 amendments to the 12 bills we studied, most were proposed by non-government parliamentarians, opposition members or government backbenchers. Only a tiny fraction of these were passed. Of the 752 agreed amendments, almost all came from government itself. But on closer inspection, most government amendments have little policy substance, being trivial tidying up measures or consequential or more important amendments. Where government amendments did have policy substance, a clear majority were traceable to pressures from non-government parliamentarians. Most were concessions given in response to non-government amendments withdrawn by their proposers following government promises to reconsider. Some responded directly to select committees. In many cases where government didn't respond to a select committee's demand, this was pursued by non-government amendments, which the government backed down to. There were various major changes made to the bills under these kinds of pressure, which are visible, but only if you look closely. One of the most high profile, which nicely joins together a number of issues, came on Labour's Health Bill 2005-6, which introduced the smoking ban in public places. The government's original intention, set out in Labour's 2005 manifesto, was to introduce a partial ban with certain exemptions for pubs not serving food and for private members' clubs. But these exemptions concerned health professionals, and they also concerned the House of Commons Health Committee, which gathered evidence and published a highly critical report. Members of the committee proposed a cross-party amendment to introduce a full ban and pressed the government to allow a free vote on it. The government, seeing the danger, gave in, and when a free vote was held, MPs overwhelmingly backed the committee's position rather than the government's original plan. This was a climb down, but not notably a government defeat. As often happens, faced with difficulties, ministers held a free vote rather than risking the humiliation of defeat in the Commons. This makes sense politically, of course, but it also masks parliamentary power. The heat goes out of the issue, the media pays less attention, and most of the public never hears that Parliament has won a victory over government. In a now familiar reprieve, that was all about visible influence. But our interviews told a much more complex story. As one civil servant put it, preparing legislation, the sponsoring department will have a sense of what it thinks it can ask Parliament, where it might have to concede, and what it shouldn't even ask. This is partly played out through the kind of handling strategies discussed just now, but also describes a more profound way that Parliament influences the work and the whole mindset of civil servants. As another put it, civil servants do, as do ministers, actually default to Parliament as the basis for everything. This comment was made in the context of legislation, but chimes clearly with the comment of the senior minister earlier about select committees. It could also be used to describe ministers' sensitivity to what they may be asked in parliamentary questions or in other parliamentary forums. Hence, one minister explained to us, "I'm always saying to people, you don't know how much Parliament preys on everyone's minds." He suggested we have a much stronger Parliament than you think. Another particularly striking quotation comes from an MP who, after years on the backbenches, served in a role supporting the Prime Minister in Downing Street. He admitted that when he arrived at number 10, the amount of attention paid to what happened in the Commons was quite staggering to me, who'd been in the Commons thinking I was completely impotent. This emphasises again the key role of government backbench MPs. The government depends on them for its majority, including to remain in power. If sufficient of them vote with the opposition, the government will be defeated. But matters rarely come to that point. As with select committees and as with the Lords, government always works hard to avoid conflict where it can. MPs have become more rebellious, but rebellions rarely result in government defeat in the Commons. That doesn't mean the Commons is powerless. Most of the time, it means that ministers have acted on good intelligence. The most important rebellions are probably the ones that never happen because government has already changed course. It's notable that all three politicians quoted earlier bemoaning parliamentary powerlessness and executive dominance were at the time members of the opposition. Being in opposition can doubtless be very frustrating. Government backbenchers are the ones with the biggest potential leverage in Parliament, though as the last quotation shows, they clearly don't always recognise their own power. So what have we learnt? We already knew, as Norton told us, that Parliament was an important body. It links government to citizens through MPs' representative roles. It determines who makes up the government and can ultimately remove the government from office. It requires the government to explain itself publicly and acts as an important forum for public debate. At a minimum, it publicly legitimates what government does. But it would be hard to conclude now, as Norton did in 1993, that Parliament is not a significant initiator of public policy and is an infrequent influencer of the content of public policy. Because there's no immediately comparable data for earlier periods, it's hard to tell exactly how much has changed. But our research shows that following changes such as the introduction of select committees, which incidentally address some of the shortcomings identified by scholars in the 1950s and 1960s, like those I quoted earlier, measurable policy influence is now quite easily detected if you look carefully enough. Nonetheless, one of the key messages of this talk and of our research is that Parliament's immeasurable policy influence is almost certainly far greater. If you want to know the real power of Parliament, you need to talk not just to people inside the institution, but those on the receiving end. Civil servants and ministers describe to us eloquently how pervasive the power of Parliament is over everything they do. So to conclude that Parliament's peripheral because it has few visible policy victories, or that the Commons is powerless because it rarely defeats the government, is to take far too simplistic a view of power. Norton knew this, and he pointed to Stephen Luke's 3 dimensions of power, where power is defined as A being able to get B to change their behaviour. The first dimension is where B does what A asks them to do. It can be traced by the kind of documentary analysis that we've done, showing government changing policy in response to Parliament. The second dimension includes the well-known power of anticipated reactions. B thinks about what A would want them to do and does it without needing to be asked, or alternatively desists from doing something that they think A would object to. This is less visible, but can be traced through more qualitative work, such as our interviews. It's clear that ministers and civil servants, and even sometimes those beyond government itself, dedicate serious energy to consciously thinking about how Parliament's likely to react. The third dimension was Luke's unique contribution. Here he says A may exercise power over B by influencing, shaping, or determining his very wants. He adds, is it not the supreme exercise of power to get another or others to have the desires you want them to have? This is almost certainly the way that parliamentary power, at least in contemporary Britain, operates most of the time. To use a well-known adage, which was a favorite of US President Theodore Roosevelt, particularly talking about exercise of power on the world stage, the most effective strategy may be to speak softly and carry a big stick. You may never have to use the stick, but just having it ensures you get listened to. Parliament always carried a big stick with respect to its ability to remove government from office, for example. But recent reforms have significantly enhanced the size of that stick, or perhaps provided completely new sticks. So Parliament clearly matters. We can identify 3 phases of parliamentary power: to get government to change its proposals, to get government to think through consciously what proposals it should and shouldn't put, and to unconsciously limit what government even thinks about doing. Yet we still have the kind of rhetoric we saw at the start. What are its likely effects? I think it's dangerous in 2 quite different ways. First, I have to say it's a shame if politicians talk down the power of their own institutions. This may play well to a contemporary mood of anti-politics, but if anything, it's only likely to enhance that mood. Second, if government actually slips into believing the rhetoric, it may land up in trouble. Tony Blair waited 8 years before his first House of Commons defeat over proposed 90-day detention without trial. He'd of course enjoyed huge Commons majorities and been able to withstand sizable rebellions. But by 2005, his majority was far smaller, and he lost this vote when 50 Labour MPs rebelled. MPs knew that if they didn't defeat the legislation, the House of Lords would. which I think strengthened their resolve. Nick Clegg's fate came much more quickly when his proposals for Lords reform were withdrawn in 2012 due to concerted opposition from Conservative MPs. To more seasoned observers, this had seemed inevitable from the start, but Clegg seemed to believe that a pledge in the government's programme couldn't in practice be defeated, and urged the whips to get it through. But in fact, in the end, no defeat actually occurred, but it was completely clear it was coming. So his bill was withdrawn after having had its second reading. The most dramatic miscalculation, perhaps, was David Cameron's last year when he recalled the Commons in August to ask it to vote for military action in Syria. Of course, the very fact that such a vote was considered necessary is itself something completely new, another power accrued by Parliament in the last 10 years. Without having taken careful enough soundings, in part obviously because Parliament was in recess, Cameron didn't realise the level of dissent on his own backbenches. This was a basic error, to assume you have support without asking those on your own side. We can be sure that many more phone calls were made before the recall over military action against ISIS a few weeks ago. So the moral of the story? It'd be better if politicians acknowledged that Parliament is powerful, that it matters very much. But if ever ministers forget this, Parliament's soon likely to put them right. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. We've got time to take a few questions from the audience. Could you do that side, please? Okay. So I've got one gentleman who had his hand up well before I'd finished asking for questions. So when you do ask a question, I will field them, and if you can wait for the microphone to begin, because we want them to be part of the recording. So please.
Thank you, and thank you for rewarding my keenness. Tom Cohen, UCL Transport Institute. A very interesting lecture, thank you. I wonder whether, to some extent, people's complaints about the power or not of Parliament reflect a lack of clarity concerning what Parliament is meant to be vis-à-vis the executive. We perhaps have a romantic vision that it ought to be the seat of all policy initiative and everything that's driving the policy of the country. And if it were clearer what Parliament's conceptually assigned role is, then people would have something against which to measure it. Just wondered what you thought of that.
Yeah, well, you want me to go one at a time? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and this is a point which many academics who write about Parliament have made, and it was one of the central points in Norton's book. There's also a very nice, I think it's an article, well, it's an article or a chapter by Adam Tompkins at Glasgow, which I use in my teaching, called What is Parliament For? Clarifying that Parliament isn't, and never really was intended to be, where policy is formulated. It wouldn't be very efficient to have effectively a committee with 650 members on it trying to make policy from scratch. But I think what I'm trying to say is that those things were always true. And you're right that Parliament perhaps somehow could communicate this more clearly, but it's hard to see. We have Liam Lawrence Smith here from the Commons, who thinks about these things a lot. How Parliament can better describe what it does. There's a lot of outreach activity which Parliament does, but how that central message can get through, I think, is quite difficult, especially when you've got politicians who are prepared to criticise the institution. And of course, those on the opposition side are always likely to complain about executive over-dominance and so on. So one of the problems that Parliament faces compared to other political institutions is that it doesn't speak with one voice. It speaks with numerous voices. It speaks with the Commons alone, 650 voices, and if you throw in the House of Lords, a terrifying something like 1,450 voices. So Parliament doesn't have that kind of strong sense of singular identity that perhaps the executive can achieve, and it suffers from that in some ways.
I have a gentleman here.
John Strafford. Meg, you've clearly demonstrated that Parliament matters to ministers, civil servants and the political elite. But does it matter to the people? because perhaps your next lecture should address that issue, because at the moment it's unrepresentative. Is it dealing with the issues that the people want it to deal with? Is it dealing with immigration, for example? Or is it just totally out of touch? A nice, cozy little world of its own where everybody inside it matters, but actually what it's there for, the people, are ignored.
I think I don't agree with your analysis, really. I think it's very difficult for the millions of people in this country to feel closely connected to their parliament. But there are direct or indirect connections through the MP's representative function, which is, when you say unrepresentative, I'm not sure what you mean. And there are obviously various ways, women are underrepresented, for example. It's also not representative proportionately of the way that people vote. But one of the strengths of the non-proportionate voting system that we have is at least strong connections between MPs and their constituents. Well, through their surgeries, for example, MPs receive hundreds of letters, quite possibly now thousands of emails a week from their constituents. They do try very hard to communicate. In terms of dealing with the issues that people care about, obviously, the government does set a lot of Parliament's agenda. I mean, it spends a lot of its time, for example, dealing with government bills. But the innovation that I mentioned at the end of the slide, talking about what's changed since 1993, has been a really important one. The establishment of the Backbench Business Committee in the House of Commons, which is a committee run entirely by backbenchers, scheduling time on issues requested by backbenchers. This has very much weakened government's control over the parliamentary agenda, and you've seen all sorts of issues discussed, which the government and even the opposition leaders wouldn't have wanted put on the agenda. So I think it is shifting.
Okay, Meg, you have one from the back here.
So, hello, I'm Garke. I'm a graduate researcher in politics and literature. My question actually follows on quite nicely from the previous comment. I'm interested to know what you think about whether representation in Parliament should mirror Britain's social diversity, and whether that would do something to defeat this kind of disconnect that the ordinary people seem to have over Parliament's role in politics.
Well, I think my response would be probably yes and not necessarily in turn. I think that Parliament could be more representative and should be more representative. Ethnic minorities are underrepresented, women are underrepresented. Curiously, for anyone who doesn't know, ethnic minorities are better represented in the House of Lords now than they are in the House of Commons due to the appointment system there. But I also think that in itself, it might have a marginal effect on closing the gap, but I think it would be idealistic to think that people are turned off Parliament just because it's too white or it's too male. In the face of politics, I've worked on women's representation in the past, and the face of politics, again, over that period, let's say since 1993, the face of politics is much more female than it used to be. But at the same time, I think people's sense of disconnect from politics is probably, if anything, greater than it was then. So it's not a silver bullet, but it's nonetheless an important and good thing to do.
Okay, I think we have time to take one last one, and the gentleman here has been very patient.
Thank you, John Young. My question is the power of the whips diminishing, and what's the implication?
It's a very nice, short question. Yes, it is. I've described how MPs are much more willing to vote against what they're told to do by their whips than they used to be. As I've said, Philip Cowley at Nottingham is the expert on this, but he always quotes periods in the 1950s when a whole year would go by without a single rebellious vote being cast. Now it's happening on such a regular basis, it's not news anymore unless it actually leads to a defeat. But the whip's powers have weakened in other ways, and there are connections perhaps between them. So, for example, the reform of select committees that I mentioned that happened in 2010 to enhance the independence of their membership was a move from those members being chosen by party whips to those members being elected inside their parties. And the chairs of the committees being elected on a cross-party basis by the House of Commons as a whole. Now, as I said, it's a bit early, and it's a terribly difficult job anyway to say, you know, are the committees more powerful now than they were then? How are you going to measure power? These are very complicated questions. But it is widely thought at Westminster that this has enhanced the confidence and the independence of the select committees. And the Backbench Business Committee is another example. Whips have no control over that element of the Commons agenda. So yes, I think the whip's power is to some extent draining away. And maybe that could go too far. You know, people would soon realize the benefit of cohesive political parties if we had a completely sort of chaotic, anarchic parliament where it was completely unpredictable the way that people would vote. You wouldn't be able to have stable government that way. But insofar as it's gone, I think it's been a healthy thing. I think there is now much less sort of command and control coming from party leaders and much more genuine debate and negotiation about the merits of policy. So Parliament, I think, has become more internally democratic than it used to be.
Okay. Thank you. With that, I think we must close because there's a class waiting to come in. So as we thank Meg for a really, truly fascinating lecture, can I remind you that the lunchtime lectures are every Tuesday and Thursday at the same time? And as you leave, could you please complete the little questionnaire and leave it with the people at the front desk? So thank you, Meg. Thank you.